I'm Christopher, and you are in Animal Attacks. And today, I'm breaking down the dumbest animal attacks ever recorded. From a drunk camper who kept walking toward a smell his own friends refused to follow, to paddling straight into a hippo's territory after ignoring a guide. First, let's start with the man who kept a tiger and mistook familiarity for control. It was April 12th, 2018, at a private animal facility in Crossville, Tennessee. Early evening, the light dropping, the property quiet except for the sounds of the animals. The facility sat on approximately 4 acres off a rural road and housed a number of large and exotic animals, including 2 Bengal tigers, a black bear, and several exotic birds. It was not a zoo. It was privately operated and open to visitors on a limited basis. Dylan Mercer, 31, had been keeping exotic animals for years before he started filming. He had developed his understanding of the animals through ownership and daily contact, not through formal training or professional certification. He knew the animals on his property the way someone who has lived with them for years knows them, through habit, pattern, and personal experience. That familiarity was real. It was also the basis of his confidence. And confidence built through familiarity without formal training has a particular kind of blind spot. And look, I want to be fair about this. Living with an animal for years is not nothing. That experience is real. The problem is that it can make you feel like you understand something that has never fully shown you what it is capable of. He started posting content about exotic animal care and handling. His early videos were advice-based, how to approach certain animals, how to read their behavior, what ownership actually looked like day to day. The tone was straightforward and the knowledge felt firsthand. His following grew slowly. Then one video performed far beyond anything he had posted before. The comments and shares came quickly. He watched the numbers and understood what that meant. And this is the part that gets me, because I have covered cases like this before, and this moment, the moment one video blows up and resets your understanding of what your audience wants, is the moment everything changes. After that, the content shifted. Less advice, more demonstration, less explaining, more showing. He began documenting his direct interactions with the animals on the property, particularly the tigers. The closer the interaction, the stronger the response. Viewers kept coming back to see what he would do next. The channel had approximately 4,800 followers by April 2018. The facility operated under an exhibitor license. Recent inspections had noted minor citations related to facility compliance. One of the tigers, a 4-year-old male named Raja, appeared in his content regularly. Dylan referred to the animal in videos and on stream as his boy. He described Raja as manageable, as an animal that knew him, as something different from what people imagined when they thought of a tiger. Raja weighed approximately 420 to 480 pounds. What gets me about that description, his boy, is that Dylan genuinely meant it. He believed it, and that belief is exactly what made the enclosure feel like somewhere he could walk into. On a previous stream, Dylan had mentioned that Raja had not been fed that day as part of the facility's feeding schedule, noting a minor supply delay. At approximately 7:14 p.m. on April 12th, Dylan began a live broadcast from the facility. He moved around the property while the audience grew. By 7:31 p.m., the viewer count had increased steadily. He told the audience he was going to go in with Raja. He had done this on camera before. The audience had seen it. Some of them were there specifically because they expected it. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable, because Raja had not been fed. Dylan knew that. He entered the enclosure through the service gate, still holding his phone. Bengal tigers are large ambush predators. In the wild, they close distance on prey quickly and without warning, using explosive acceleration over short distances. The forelimb strike is the primary disabling mechanism. A single blow from a fully grown Bengal tiger is capable of breaking bone and immediately destabilizing an animal larger than a human. The bite that follows is positional and sustained. Dylan stepped inside. Raja hadn't been fed for roughly a day due to a supply delay, something Dylan knew. It wasn't long enough to make the animal desperate, but it was enough to put him out of routine. And it was already the time of evening, Raja associated with feeding. Instead of waiting for that to be resolved, Dylan went in anyway, choosing to film while the animal was already keyed into that expectation. He entered the enclosure while waiting for the feed to arrive, the first. Contact was a forelimb strike, directed at the upper body. Dylan went down, the bite followed. Raja held the grip, repositioning once, in a way that wildlife professionals described as consistent with control behavior seen when large felids subdue prey. And this is the moment I find hardest to process. The audience watched it happen in real time. Several of them contacted emergency services during the stream. They were the ones who made the call. They reached the enclosure in minutes. First responders had already secured the area and isolated the animal before entry was possible. Dylan was located inside the enclosure, unresponsive. Paramedics initiated assessment immediately, but there were no signs of viable cardiac or respiratory function on arrival. Given the extent of traumatic injuries, resuscitation efforts were not initiated. He was pronounced dead at the scene at approximately 7:52 p.m. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be catastrophic traumatic injuries, consistent with a large felid attack, including blunt force impact and penetrating bite trauma. The facility was closed pending investigation. State authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed that the animal's behavior was consistent with a feeding response. Raja was euthanized the following day in accordance with safety protocol for large carnivore attacks. The exhibitor license was suspended during the review. Dylan's online accounts were taken offline shortly after. His family held a private service. One fact I can't deny is the animal did exactly what a hungry 400-pound tiger does when a person walks into its space at feeding time, and it paid for that with its life too. It was September 3rd, 2017, in Amboseli National Park, Kenya. The golden hour light that photographers prize was casting long shadows across the savanna, where Mount Kilimanjaro provided a stunning backdrop. The landscape was dotted with elephant herds moving slowly across the plains, their family groups tight and protective. Alina Petrova was 26 years old. She worked as a travel influencer from Moscow, her Instagram account having grown to over 50,000 followers through a combination of stunning landscape photography and increasingly poor decisions. Her feed showed her posing near elephants, standing uncomfortably close to hippos, and generally treating Africa's most dangerous animals as props for her personal brand. She was on a guided tour when her vehicle encountered a small elephant herd with several young calves. The elephants were moving slowly, feeding on acacia branches, their movements calm and unhurried. Alina saw an opportunity for a dramatic shot, herself in the foreground with a baby elephant and Mount Kilimanjaro in the background. This would require positioning herself between the calf and its mother. Her guide was a Kenyan man named Samuel, who had worked in Amboseli for over a decade. He immediately warned the group not to approach. He explained that elephant mothers were extremely protective, that the entire herd would defend a calf, and that elephants killed more people in Africa than any other large animal except hippos. Alina dismissed his warning and exited the vehicle without permission. She began walking toward the calf, moving in an arc that would position her between the baby and its mother. The calf noticed her and stopped feeding, its small trunk lifting to catch her scent. The mother noticed immediately. Her ears, which had been relaxed and fanned out for cooling, suddenly spread wide and forward, the first warning sign of elephant aggression. Samuel began shouting from the vehicle. Alina continued walking, her camera held at arm's length for a selfie. At approximately 15 meters from the calf, the mother elephant began her charge. There was no gradual buildup, no second warning. African elephants can weigh up to 14,000 pounds and reach speeds of 25 miles per hour when charging. When a mother elephant with a calf charges, she intends to eliminate the threat. Alina had positioned herself as that threat. The elephant covered the distance in seconds, her massive bulk moving with terrifying speed. Alina turned to run. She managed 4 steps before the elephant's trunk wrapped around her waist and knocked her to the ground. Elephant trunks contain over 40,000 muscles and can lift over 600 pounds. The elephant threw Alina to the ground with enough force to fracture her pelvis and several vertebrae. Alina hit the dirt hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending her camera flying. She tried to crawl away. The elephant was not finished. The elephant reared up and brought her front legs down on Alina's lower body, crushing her legs and pelvis with several tons of force. The sound of breaking bones was audible from the vehicle. The elephant then pressed her massive weight down on Alina's chest, using her body mass to pin the threat to the ground. Alina's ribcage collapsed under the pressure, her lungs unable to expand. The elephant stood and stepped back, then charged forward again, using her head to batter Alina's body and her feet to trample her repeatedly. This continued for approximately 30 seconds. The entire herd had now become alert and agitated, several other females moving toward the scene with their ears spread in aggressive postures. Samuel started the vehicle and began driving toward the scene while honking the horn, attempting to distract the elephant without getting close enough to trigger a charge against the vehicle. The mother elephant, satisfied that the threat had been eliminated, returned to her calf and began moving the baby away from the area. The herd followed, leaving Alina's body motionless on the ground. Rangers arrived approximately 40 minutes later, alerted by radio. Alina had died from massive crush injuries. Her pelvis was shattered, her legs were broken in multiple places, her ribcage was collapsed, and her internal organs had suffered catastrophic trauma from the trampling. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation from chest compression combined with massive internal bleeding. Amboselli authorities declined to take action against the elephant, noting that the attack was a straightforward defensive response to a direct threat against a calf. Officials emphasized that existing regulations had been perfectly clear and that the regulations had been explained to Alina by Samuel approximately 4 minutes before her death. The video she had been recording during her approach was recovered from her camera, showing the final moments before the elephant charged. It was used by park authorities as a training tool. It was, in this way, the most viewed content she ever produced. It was August 27th, 2016. And a hiking party of 4 had left a trailhead in a national forest in a remote county in Wyoming at 6:30 in the morning. The air at 9,400 feet was cold and clear, the kind of early mountain morning that feels like the day is on your side. It was not going to stay that way. Stephen Merritt was 45 years old and lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he worked as a high school biology teacher. He had been making backcountry trips in Wyoming and Colorado for over 15 years, and considered himself an experienced and prepared wilderness traveler. His pack for the trip was well assembled and included a first aid kit, an emergency thermal blanket, a water filter, a backup headlamp, and a satellite communicator. Before leaving home, however, he had made one specific decision. He was not going to carry bear spray. He told the 3 friends he was hiking with that it was extra weight, that he had never encountered a bear at close range in 15 years, and that the odds were low enough to skip it. One of his companions, a man named Joel, carried his own canister. The other 2 did not. The mountain range covers over 1,000 square miles of remote alpine terrain across western Wyoming, with no cell service and limited radio range once a hiker is more than a few miles in. The National Forest website, the trailhead kiosk, and the local ranger station all carry the same advisory: carry bear spray and know how to use it. The ranger at the local office had told the group the previous afternoon that grizzly activity had been elevated along the Upper Lake Corridor that summer due to increased late-season bear movement through alpine basins. The group's plan was a 3-day loop of approximately 26 miles through the Upper Lake Basin. The first day passed without incident. On the second day, they continued north into the Upper Basin. By mid-afternoon, they had entered a wide alpine meadow with scattered white bark pine groves at the upper edge. The trees were heavy with cone crop. In late August, grizzly bears focused almost entirely on food. It will often not register an approaching hiker, but it will respond to a sudden close-range surprise without hesitation. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Stephen was hiking about 30 feet ahead of the rest of the group when he rounded a large granite boulder at the tree line and found himself within 20 feet of a large male grizzly, estimated at between 450 and 500 pounds. The bear was standing on its hind legs against a white bark pine, focused on cone clusters above. He dropped down the moment he registered Stephen, and they were face to face at 20 feet. There was a single second of stillness. The bear charged. He covered the distance in roughly a second. Stephen had no time to retreat, and the boulder to his right limited movement. Joel, 30 feet behind, cleared the boulder and saw the situation instantly. He drew his canister, aimed, and discharged it in a forward arc. The cloud of capsaicin reached the bear's face at close range and struck him as he lunged. He broke sharply to the left, swiping at the air, eyes and nose already reacting. But in the fraction of a second before the spray fully diverted him, he had already made forceful contact. His right forepaw struck Stephen across his right forearm with enough force to fracture the radius and severely damage the ulna. In the same motion, his jaws clamped onto Stephen's upper right shoulder, crushing through muscle and causing deep puncture wounds before the spray drove him off. The bear crashed into the brush and did not return. The entire contact lasted only a few seconds. The group activated Stephen's satellite communicator within 60 seconds. Stephen was conscious, but in severe pain, and the shoulder wound was deep with visible muscle damage, while the forearm was visibly deformed and bleeding heavily through the torn sleeve of his jacket. The group applied continuous direct pressure, immobilized the arm as best they could, and treated him for shock using supplies from the first aid kit. A search and rescue response was initiated through the local county system. A civilian medical helicopter reached the group's coordinates at 5:40 in the afternoon, approximately 3.5 hours after the attack. Stephen was transported to a regional medical center in Wyoming. He underwent emergency surgery that evening. Surgeons repaired vascular damage in the shoulder, debrided extensive crushed muscle tissue, stabilized the forearm fractures with internal fixation. Surgeons noted extensive crush injury with vascular compromise that had reduced tissue perfusion prior to arrival. He required multiple additional debridement procedures over the following days to remove devitalized tissue. On the second day post-surgery, he developed acute compartment syndrome in his right forearm due to swelling from the crush injury, requiring emergency fasciotomy. Despite aggressive surgical management, high-dose intravenous antibiotics, and intensive care support, he developed septic shock with multi-organ failure, secondary to the extensive crush injury, and contaminated bite wounds to his shoulder. His condition deteriorated over the following days in the intensive care unit, and he died 5 days after the attack. The authorities issued a formal incident report documenting the circumstances of the encounter, including that bear spray had been available near the trailhead, that the group had been advised to carry it, and that the single canister deployed had been sufficient to stop the attack before it escalated further. The Grizzly was not located, despite an aerial search, and was not considered a candidate for removal, because the behavior was consistent with a defensive surprise encounter. It was September 22, 2017, in Kenya's Masai Mara National Reserve, where golden grass stretched across the plains under a crisp morning sky. A pride of lions lay scattered among termite mounds, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Jovel Tirado, 26, was a Filipina living in Dubai, working full-time as a dental hygienist while building her social media presence. She had just over 14,000 followers and was deeply invested in creating content that could grow her platform. She had no formal wildlife experience, no prior safari trip, and relied entirely on what she had seen online. It's surprising how fast curiosity and wanting something more can get someone into trouble in the wild. Even a careful person can be in serious danger from just one choice. The first 2 days passed without incident. Jovel filmed constantly, narrating her experience with energy, but the footage lacked the dramatic edge she wanted. By the second evening, she expressed frustration to her friend Dina, seeking something more visually striking. On the morning of September 22nd, the group returned to a spot where a lion pride had been seen the day before, about 120 meters away and partly hidden. The guide, Elijah Koske, made it clear no one should leave the vehicle. Jovel asked to step out for a walking shot, ignoring repeated warnings and citing online videos. Even I also wanted to step out sometimes for a better angle, thinking I could handle it. And reading this really makes me realize how quickly that confidence can become deadly. While Elijah briefly stepped out to check a tire, she quietly opened her door, handed her phone to a friend, and walked several meters into the grass. A male lion, lying flat behind a termite mound 40 meters away, saw her isolated movement and instantly triggered its ambush instinct. Once the charge began, escape was nearly impossible. The lion struck from behind, knocking her to the ground with full force. The initial impact incapacitated her immediately. In the same sequence, the lion secured a bite at the back of her neck and upper spine. The motion was precise and controlled, causing instant collapse of motor function. Her body went still within seconds. Even imagining that moment makes my stomach drop. Just a few seconds, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The lion shifted slightly to maintain a throat hold, while pinning her to the ground. There was no prolonged struggle, no hesitation. The animal remained calm and deliberate. By the time Elijah reached her, the critical phase was complete. A warning shot caused the lion to release and retreat back to the pride. Jovel was unresponsive. Medical assessment later determined death occurred in less than a minute due to spinal trauma and suffocation. She had been outside the vehicle for under 90 seconds. This timeline highlights how fast irreversible outcomes can happen, faster than most people can process in real time. Emergency services followed protocol, but intervention was impossible once the attack began. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Investigators confirmed the guide was not responsible. He had denied all requests to exit the vehicle. The lion was not destroyed, acting in line with natural predatory behavior. Even I sometimes feel tempted to step out for a better view or shot, but in predator areas, I've learned that the vehicle isn't just a convenience, it's your lifeline. Once you leave it, you're instantly exposed, and no amount of warnings can physically stop a sudden move. Following the rules completely, every time, is the only way to stay safe. Jovelle's body was returned to the Philippines, where her family held a private funeral. Her social media accounts remained unchanged, her final post still visible from the night before, captioned with anticipation for the next day. What remains is the quiet series of ordinary choices, moving outside the vehicle, seeking a better shot, that combine in seconds to create a fatal outcome. It was July 18th, 2015, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines of Yellowstone National Park, where the summer tourist season had brought thousands of visitors eager to photograph the park's famous wildlife. The parking area near Dunraven Pass was crowded with vehicles as families hoped to catch glimpses of the black bears and grizzlies that frequently foraged in the area's berry-rich meadow. The park had thoughtfully provided a mandatory safety orientation for all visitors. Clara Martinez had skipped it. Clara Martinez was a 27-year-old marketing coordinator from Phoenix, Arizona, whose vacation planning consisted primarily of researching the most Instagram-worthy locations rather than understanding the environments she intended to visit. She had skipped the orientation specifically to get to scenic locations before other tourists, which, in retrospect, was an interesting set of priorities. Clara had spent the morning driving through the park's interior roads, frustrated by the distance between herself and the animals she encountered. Other tourists photographed elk and bison from the required 25-yard minimum distance without complaint. Clara found this approach insufficiently dramatic. When she spotted a large grizzly bear foraging near the tree line, she saw an opportunity for the kind of close-up shot that would generate serious social media engagement, and made a series of decisions that would also generate serious consequences. The bear, a mature female grizzly weighing approximately 300 to 350 pounds, had been feeding on huckleberries in a meadow adjacent to the parking area. Park rangers had been monitoring the animal throughout the week, noting her increasing comfort around human activity and her tendency to investigate vehicles for food sources. Clara had signed a form at the park entrance acknowledging that feeding wildlife was both illegal and dangerous. She then drove to the meadow and prepared to feed the wildlife. She parked approximately 30 feet from the bear, rolled down her passenger window, and began making clicking sounds while waving a granola bar out the window. The bear looked up from her foraging, immediately focusing on the scent of processed food. From the bear's perspective, a person had parked nearby and was waving food at her. This was not a confusing situation. Grizzly bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting food sources from over a mile away. An adult female can weigh between 290 and 400 pounds, with powerful limbs capable of propelling them at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. Their claws can reach up to 4 inches in length, and their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. The bear approached with deliberate steps, her massive head swaying as she tested the air. Clara held the granola bar further outside the window, attempting to coax the bear closer for a better shot. The bear rose on her hind legs, placed her front paws on the car's doorframe, and brought her massive head level with Clara's window. The bear's weight caused the car door to creak ominously, her claws leaving deep gouges in the paint as she repositioned for a better angle at the food. When Clara tried to pull the granola bar back inside the vehicle, the bear lunged toward the open window, pressing her head and shoulders against the door. The bear's claws raked across Clara's chest and arms as she struggled, tearing through her shirt and opening deep lacerations across her torso. Clara screamed and tried to push the bear away. The bear, weighing approximately 350 pounds, was not pushed away. Clara managed to open the driver's side door and attempted to escape, but the bear's weight pressed against the door frame, limiting her movement and trapping her against the passenger seat. The animal's massive paw struck Clara across the side of her head with devastating force, fracturing her skull and sending her glasses flying. The blow caused immediate severe trauma, her vision darkening as she slumped against the seat. The bear bit down on Clara's left shoulder and neck, powerful jaws crushing through muscle and bone. The bite severed her carotid artery, and blood began pouring from the wound at an alarming rate. Clara's attempts to scream were reduced to gurgling sounds as the bear shook her violently, the way a predator dispatches prey. Other tourists in the parking area began honking their horns and shouting, but the commotion came too late. The bear had dragged Clara partially out of the vehicle through the driver's side door, her body limp and unresponsive. By the time park rangers arrived with bear spray and firearms, Clara had lost consciousness from massive blood loss and traumatic injuries. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call, but Clara was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be exsanguination from the severed carotid artery, combined with catastrophic head trauma and crush injuries to her chest and neck. Park authorities euthanized the bear after determining that her escalating food conditioning posed an unacceptable risk to visitor safety. Clara, who had created that food conditioning through deliberate and illegal feeding, had paid the ultimate price. The incident prompted Yellowstone to implement stricter enforcement of wildlife interaction regulation and increase the penalties for feeding animals.
It was March 22, 2017, and the wet season was beginning its retreat from the Osa Peninsula on Costa Rica's southern Pacific coast. The lowland rainforest remained saturated from months of heavy rainfall, its canopy dripping onto a forest floor thick with decomposing leaves, fallen branches, and tangled root systems. The region's remote river valleys attracted field researchers from around the world. Stellan Edevard was a 31-year-old Swedish field biologist employed by a European conservation group conducting a long-term amphibian survey along the peninsula's river systems. He held a doctoral degree in tropical ecology and had spent portions of the previous 4 years conducting fieldwork across Central and South America. His current rotation had him based at a small research station approximately 7 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a footpath through dense primary forest. Working alongside Edevard was Rolando Esquivel Chacon, a 35-year-old local research assistant employed at the station for 6 years. The two conducted evening surveys along transect lines following stream corridors, carrying handheld cameras and audio equipment for documentation. Fer-de-lance encounters were common along the routes, and the team carried basic first aid supplies and a satellite radio. On the evening of the 22nd, Edevard and Esquivel departed the station at approximately 4:30 to survey a transect along a narrow tributary roughly 2 miles upstream. The trail followed the stream bank through a section where the canopy reduced ground-level light to near darkness by late afternoon. They had completed approximately half the transect when Edevard stepped off the trail to photograph a specimen on a low branch overhanging the water. His right foot came down on or immediately beside a fer-de-lance concealed in the leaf litter at the trail's edge. Fer-de-lance vipers, known locally as Terciopelo, are the most medically significant venomous snakes in Central America, responsible for more snakebite fatalities in the region than any other species. Adults commonly reach 5 to 7 feet in length, with a heavy, muscular body and prominent heat-sensing pits. Their cryptic coloring provides near-perfect camouflage in leaf litter. Fer-de-lance venom is both hemotoxic and cytotoxic, damaging blood vessels and surrounding tissue while disrupting the body's clotting system. Envenomation produces rapid and severe swelling, intense pain, hemorrhaging, and progressive tissue death. Systemic effects include dropping blood pressure and shock. Without antivenom, severe envenomation can become life-threatening within hours if untreated, though fatalities often occur later due to systemic bleeding or shock. The strike hit the gap between the top of Edevard's rubber boot and his field pants, the fangs penetrating his right ankle just above the boot line. The pain was immediate and severe. The snake recoiled into the leaf litter and disappeared within seconds. Esquivel turned and saw Edevard on the stream bank, gripping his ankle. 2 puncture wounds were visible, already bleeding freely. Esquivel immobilized the leg and activated the satellite radio to contact the research station. The station coordinator relayed an emergency request to the nearest hospital, located in a coastal town over 2 hours away by road, which itself required a 7-mile hike from the station. Polyvalent antivenom was stocked at that hospital, but nowhere closer. Within 30 minutes, swelling had begun spreading through Edevard's lower leg, the skin discoloring as tissue damage advanced. His ability to walk diminished quickly. The two began the slow return to the station, Edevard leaning heavily on Esquivel with every step. The 2-mile hike took well over an hour. By the time they arrived, the swelling had spread further, and he was showing signs of systemic distress, his skin pale and clammy, his pulse rapid and weak. The 7-mile trail to the road required further transport by foot and mule. Total elapsed time from bite to reaching the road exceeded 3 hours. Edevard lost consciousness during the vehicle transfer. His blood pressure had dropped as systemic shock and severe envenomation overwhelmed field treatment. Stellan Edevard was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The research station's emergency protocols were reviewed following the incident, and the organization implemented rapid evacuation protocols and coordinated anti-venom access with regional hospitals. Esquivel's handheld camera footage was submitted to the conservation group's internal safety review and to Costa Rican wildlife authorities. The organization declined media requests for the footage, citing respect for Edevard's family and the ongoing protocol review.
It was June 14, 2015, in the Serengeti National Park, Tanzania. The golden light of mid-morning illuminated the endless grasslands where the Great Migration had drawn tourists from around the world. The landscape was dotted with safari vehicles, each maintaining careful distance from wildlife. Daniel Mercer was 31 years old. He worked on his family's cattle farm outside Sydney and had spent his entire life around domesticated livestock. He had somehow concluded that this experience translated to African wildlife. He had joined a guided group safari, one of 8 tourists packed into a modified Land Cruiser with a pop-up roof designed for optimal wildlife viewing. The guide was a Tanzanian man named Joseph, who had spent 15 years navigating these plains. He had delivered the standard safety briefing with the weary tone of someone who had given it hundreds of times and still occasionally watched tourists ignore it. They encountered a lone Cape buffalo bull grazing approximately 40 meters from the road. His massive horns curved upward in the distinctive boss formation that made him instantly recognizable as one of Africa's most dangerous animals. Cape buffalo are responsible for more hunter and tourist deaths than any other large animal on the continent. Joseph explained that buffalo were unpredictable and aggressive, known to charge without warning. He noted that this was particularly true of old bulls like this one, who had likely been expelled from his herd and was now irritable and territorial. Daniel announced that the buffalo looked just like the cows back home and that he wanted to get closer for a photo. Joseph explained that Cape buffalo were not like the cows back home and that approaching one on foot was prohibited and dangerous. Daniel explained that he had grown up around cattle and knew how to handle them. He then exited the vehicle. Cape buffalo can weigh up to 2,000 pounds, stand over 5 feet tall at the shoulder, and possess horns that can gore through a vehicle door. They can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour, despite their bulk. They are known for their tendency to circle back and attack again, even after being wounded. They hold grudges, remember threats, and have been documented ambushing hunters who wounded them days earlier. Daniel walked toward the buffalo with his hand extended, making soft clicking noises, of the sort that might calm a nervous heifer. The buffalo raised his head and stared at Daniel with focused attention. Daniel interpreted this as interest. At approximately 20 meters, the buffalo's body language shifted. His head lowered slightly, his muscles tensed, his tail lifted. These are the warning signs that precede a Cape buffalo charge. Joseph began shouting from the vehicle. Daniel continued walking forward. The buffalo charged from a standstill, accelerating to full speed within seconds. 2,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and horn closed the distance before Daniel's brain could process what was happening. He turned to run and managed 3 steps before the buffalo's horns caught him from below. The impact drove the buffalo's horns upward into Daniel's abdomen and thigh, goring him deeply. He crashed to the ground face first, the air driven from his lung, blood already soaking through his shirt from the deep puncture wounds. The buffalo did not stop. The animal wheeled around and charged again, this time catching Daniel in the chest and side as he attempted to crawl away. The horns punched into his torso, causing massive internal trauma and breaking multiple ribs. The buffalo then trampled Daniel with his massive hooves, each impact crushing bone and tissue. The animal stood over Daniel's body, snorting and pawing the ground, ensuring the threat had been neutralized. Joseph radioed for emergency assistance, but could not approach while the buffalo remained aggressive and territorial. Other vehicles arrived and attempted to drive the buffalo away using horns and engine noise, but the animal held his position for several minutes, occasionally charging toward the vehicles before returning to stand near Daniel's body. Finally, sustained pressure from multiple vehicles caused the buffalo to move off into the bush. By the time rangers reached Daniel, he had died from massive internal injuries, blood loss, and trauma to multiple organ systems. The cause of death was determined to be multiple horn punctures, resulting in catastrophic damage to his liver, intestines, and major blood vessels, combined with crush injuries from trampling. Serengeti authorities used the incident to reinforce existing safety protocols, though officials noted that the protocols had been explained clearly and followed without incident by by every other tourist in the vehicle that morning. The Cape buffalo was not tracked or euthanized, as the attack was classified as a defensive response to a human approaching on foot in open territory. Joseph submitted his incident report and returned to work the following morning. He had seen tourists ignore advice before. This was the first time he had watched one try to approach a Cape buffalo on foot. It was July 14, 2015, in a remote section of Flathead National Forest, Montana. Late afternoon, around 5:30 p.m., dense lodgepole pine. Low visibility, roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light wind pushing east. The trail wasn't maintained. No markers, nothing on any official map. Just a worn line through the trees that ends wherever the forest decides it does. Chet Mulvey was 34, a construction foreman out of Missoula. He was out for the weekend with two friends. No real itinerary, camping since the day before. Early afternoon, he had been drinking steadily for several hours. His friends estimated 6 to 8 beers over a 4-hour window. I want to be careful not to make this entirely about that, because people make bad decisions in the backcountry sober all the time. But it matters here, because what comes next required a level of judgment Chet simply didn't have access to at that point. He had no bear spray. Neither did his friends. At the Forest Road entry, a handwritten notice warned of recent grizzly activity in the drainage they were walking into. All three of them saw it. They kept walking. About 100 feet before the clearing, one of his friends mentioned a smell. Strong, rotten, the kind that sits in the back of your throat. I've read enough of these to know exactly what that smell means, and I think most people do too, even if they've never encountered it before. It's not subtle. Ahead in the tree line, flies were clustered above one specific point and two ravens were working the canopy directly above it. Chet's friends noted both. Chet dismissed them and kept walking, pulling ahead of the group. That smell, those birds, that specific combination in grizzly country that is not an ambiguous signal. It points to one thing: a large ungulate carcass in an advanced state of decomposition, the signature of a grizzly food cache. A grizzly will kill or scavenge, partially consume, cover the remains with dirt and debris, and stay in the immediate area for days, returning to feed. The cache is a defended resource. Chet was walking directly toward it, with nothing on him that would have made any difference. What strikes me about this part of the story is that Chet wasn't alone. He had two friends with him, two people who smelled the same thing, saw the same birds, and were standing on the same unmarked trail in the same grizzly drainage. And yet nobody stopped him. Nobody grabbed his arm or said, "Wait, I'm not placing the blame on them." I don't think I would have known how to stop someone who had already made up their mind either. But the fact that three people walked toward that smell together and only one of them kept going tells you something about where Chet's head was at that point in the afternoon. It also tells you something about how alcohol changes the way a person processes their environment. Not dramatically, not in a way that's obvious from the outside. Chet wasn't stumbling or incoherent. He was functional enough to walk a trail and hold a conversation. But the part of the brain that weighs risk, that takes a smell and a cluster of ravens and a warning sign and connects them into a single coherent picture, that part operates on a much thinner margin when it's impaired. 6 to 8 beers over 4 hours doesn't make a person reckless in an obvious way. It makes them just slightly less likely to stop. And in grizzly country, on an unmarked trail with a food cache, somewhere ahead in the tree line, slightly less likely to stop is all it takes. The grizzly bear is one of the few animals in North America that will engage without hesitation when a food cache is involved. Adult males in the northern Rockies weigh between 400 and 790 pounds and can reach 35 miles per hour over short distances, fast enough to close ground before most people have finished processing what they're seeing. The behavior around a cache is not predatory. The bear is not hunting. It is defending something it has already claimed, and the threshold for that response is extremely low, often without bluffing or warning, no posturing. The moment something enters that space, the bear moves. That distinction matters for understanding why it happened. It does not change what happened. Chet stepped into a small clearing about 85 feet ahead of his friends. The carcass was there, a partially consumed elk covered in dirt and pine debris, roughly 20 feet to his left. The grizzly, a large adult male, was just beyond it, partially obscured by a downed log. The wind was moving east, carrying Chet's scent directly toward the bear. It had almost certainly been aware of him before he cleared the tree line. He stopped. His friends estimated 3 to 4 seconds. long enough to see the bear, long enough for the bear to have a full read on him, and then he raised his arm and waved it toward the animal. His friends described it as dismissive, like waving off a stray dog. I have gone back to that detail more times than I can count. A grizzly on a food cache, and Chet waved at it. The bear charged within 2 seconds. The distance closed in under 3. First contact was a strike across his upper left shoulder and neck, the kind of impact that drops a person from force alone, not pain. The bear followed immediately with a bite to the back of the skull and upper cervical spine. That second contact was the fatal injury. Investigators described the pattern as consistent with a defensive kill response. Bear was not feeding. It was neutralizing a threat to its cache. His 2 friends heard the impact and a single shout. They did not enter the clearing. They retreated to the trailhead, flagged down a passing truck, and drove 9 miles to a seasonal outpost on the forest boundary. No cell service, limited staff, not a full response station. From the time of the attack to the time a wildlife team reached the clearing, 2 hours and 40 minutes. I think about that number sometimes. 2 hours and 40 minutes is a long time to sit with what they had just witnessed and not be able to do a single thing about it. Chet was found roughly 10 feet from the point of first contact. The bear had not fed. Cause of death was the bite to the posterior skull and upper cervical spine. The strike had dropped him. The bite had killed him. The elk carcass was confirmed as an active food cache. The case was ruled a death by wildlife encounter. No investigation was opened. No action taken against the bear. The behavior was consistent with normal cache defense. It was May 18th, 2014, at a privately licensed wildlife sanctuary in Lumpkin County, Georgia. In the central bear habitat, a 340-pound American black bear named Atlas paced along the interior fence line. Derek Paulson was 29 years old and had driven to the sanctuary that Sunday with his girlfriend of 3 weeks. During the drive, he had already begun boasting about his nerve, about how most people were too soft to really experience anything, about how fences and warning signs were designed for the fearful. He viewed the visit partly as a stage, and he had already decided he would not leave it without a story worth telling. The sanctuary operated on 42 acres approximately 90 miles north of Atlanta and was licensed under federal wildlife facility regulations. The bear enclosure was constructed of heavy-gauge chain-link fencing approximately 8 feet high with an inward-angled overhang at the top. It was built decades earlier under older standards and grandfathered in under updated regulations. Warning placards were mounted at regular intervals. Do not enter. Active bear habitat. Stay behind barrier at all times. Black bears rely heavily on rapid, explosive swats rather than prolonged mauling, and a single forepaw strike can generate enough force to break large bones. They can sprint up to 30 to 35 miles per hour over short distances. Atlas had no history of aggression toward staff, but no unfamiliar person had ever entered his enclosure. At the start of the tour, the guide, Dana, clearly stated that the railing and fence marked a strict boundary and that climbing or crossing either barrier was prohibited. Derek initially remained behind the railing, though he spent most of that time making dismissive remarks under his breath, calling the warnings excessive, saying the bear looked practically tame. When his girlfriend quietly suggested they simply watch, he stiffened. He had something to prove. When Dana rounded a bend in the path with several visitors, momentarily obscured by a stand of trees and the shifting cluster of guests, Derek stepped over the secondary railing. He gripped a vertical support post beside the chain link panel and began climbing, using the post for leverage. The outward angled extension, which projected roughly 18 inches inward, forced him to hook an elbow over the top rail and shift his weight carefully before swinging a leg past the angled section. After reaching the top, he swung a leg over and dropped down inside the enclosure. The bear was approximately 30 feet away when he registered movement within the habitat. He turned toward Derek, head lowered, ears angled back, and released a sharp huff before taking several stiff-legged steps forward that quickly escalated into a short, accelerating charge. Derek turned back toward the fence, but did not have time to climb. The first contact was a forceful forepaw strike that caught him across the left shoulder and upper back, knocking him to the ground. He fell hard and struck the side of his head against the packed substrate. The bear approached immediately and bit into the upper portion of his left shoulder while he was prone. The bite was forceful, accompanied by a brief shaking motion, before the bear released and repositioned. Outside the enclosure, his girlfriend began shouting. Dana initiated the emergency protocol and ordered visitors to clear the fence line. A staff member triggered a compressed air horn mounted near the habitat. The horn sounded repeatedly, rather than once. After several blasts, Atlas released his grip and moved away at a fast walk toward the opposite side of the enclosure. The entire physical interaction lasted under a minute, though subsequent review indicated it felt longer to witnesses. Staff secured the perimeter and prevented further intrusion. Emergency services from Dahlonega arrived shortly. Derek had sustained deep lacerations and puncture wounds to his left shoulder and upper back, along with significant head trauma from the fall. He was conscious but disoriented during initial assessment. He was transported to a medical center. Surgery was performed that evening to repair vascular injury in his shoulder region and to address a subdural hematoma caused by the impact. Over the next 24 hours, neurological swelling increased despite surgical intervention, and his responsiveness steadily declined. He died on May 20th, 2 days after the incident. Investigators determined that the enclosure met construction standards and that the breach resulted from deliberate visitor misconduct, though they recommended increasing the standoff distance as an added precaution. Tours were temporarily suspended during the investigation before the facility reopened. It was September 18th, 2018, in backcountry terrain near Glacier National Park, Montana. Early morning. The light was low and the air was cold. The ground was a mix of open meadow and dense forest, the kind of terrain that changes quickly between clear sightlines and thick cover. The park and surrounding land carry one of the highest grizzly densities in the contiguous United States. Larry Bennett, 29, was from Missoula and had spent multiple seasons traveling alone through backcountry wilderness in the region. He documented his trips on a vlog with approximately 7,200 followers. His content was grounded and detailed: trail conditions, navigation, wildlife sightings at a distance. He knew the terrain and moved through it with confidence built over years of solo travel. That experience was real. It shaped how he read situations and how much he trusted his own judgment when the signs were not obvious. And look, I want to be honest here. If you watch his earlier content before the subseries, it is genuinely good, careful, detailed, respectful of the environment. This was not always a reckless channel. That makes what came next harder to watch. Over time, his content shifted. He began a subseries he called The Long Approach. The premise was simple: locate a specific wild animal across multiple days and film it at progressively closer range. The subject he chose was a grizzly sow with 2 yearling cubs. He found her in the same general area across several outings and began tracking her movements, returning each day to film from a shorter distance than the day before. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Because the subseries had a name, he had planned it. Over 11 days, the distance closed from approximately 300 yards to 60 yards. Each session was filmed and uploaded. Each one showed him a little closer than the last. He narrated this progress as evidence that the animal was becoming accustomed to his presence, that the lack of a charge meant acceptance, that tolerance and habituation were the same thing. They are not. A grizzly that does not charge is not a grizzly that has accepted a human. A sow with yearling cubs operates under a different set of pressures than a solitary bear. She is not assessing whether a nearby human is a threat to herself alone. She is assessing whether it is a threat to her cubs. I actually spent 3 hours going through wildlife research specifically on sow behavior for this case, and what I found is that a sow with cubs does not give you signals the way a solitary bear does. She waits, and then she does not. Larry had been watching the same bear for 11 days and had not been charged. That history became the basis of his confidence. Because nothing had happened yet, he treated it as evidence that nothing would happen. This is a common and dangerous pattern. Each time he closed distance, he moved the threshold closer to where he was standing. What gets me about that logic is how completely reasonable it sounds from the inside. 11 days, no charge. Of course he felt safe. The bear had never given him a reason not to. On the 12th day, he returned to the same area and closed the distance further. At approximately 40 yards, he was still filming. The sow was present with her cubs. At 40 yards, a grizzly bear covers the distance to a human in under 3 seconds. There is no time to deploy bear spray at that range if the charge has already begun. There is no safe direction to move. The terrain at that distance does not offer cover. That means anything against an animal of that speed and weight. And this is the moment everything that had been building for 11 days came to its conclusion. The sow charged. The initial impact was from the full force of the animal's body weight moving at speed. The contact that followed included biting and clawing, consistent with a defensive encounter, not a predatory one. A defensive grizzly attack is not an attempt to kill and consume. It is an attempt to neutralize a perceived threat. The animal attacks until it determines the threat is gone, then disengages. The injuries produced in that time are severe, regardless of the animal's intent. The duration was brief. When the bear disengaged, Larry was on the ground. He was alive. He attempted to move and covered approximately 200 meters from the point of contact before he could not continue. Search teams were deployed after he failed to return and could not be contacted. He was located in backcountry terrain several hours later, approximately 200 meters from the point of initial contact. Responders reached him on foot and initiated assessment, but he was unresponsive with no detectable pulse. Due to the extent of blood loss and the time elapsed, resuscitation was not possible. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be exsanguination, resulting from traumatic injuries sustained in a grizzly bear attack. Wildlife officials investigated the area and confirmed the presence of a sow with cubs. The attack was classified as defensive behavior. The bear was not euthanized, as no ongoing threat to the public was identified. The area was temporarily closed as a precaution. Larry's scheduled content was taken offline, and his family held a service in Missoula. And the part that stays with me about Larry Bennett, the detail I cannot move past, is that scheduled video going live while he was dying out there. His audience was watching old footage of him getting closer to that bear while he was already gone. That is the part that keeps me up. It was July 12, 2018, on the remote banks of the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where early morning mist hovered over narrow channels and papyrus reeds swayed gently in the breeze. Tourists often describe this area as serene, but beneath the calm surface lurked one of Africa's most efficient aquatic predators. Samuel Dorrance, 33, a British wildlife filmmaker and aspiring YouTuber, had traveled alone from London to capture footage of a rare Sitatunga antelope herd. Experienced with cameras and drones, he had no formal survival training in crocodile habitats. Samuel had booked a private Mokoro tour, the traditional dugout canoe excursions that glide silently along the channels, with local guide Temba Kama, 41. Temba knew the delta and its dangers, giving daily briefings about staying low, keeping hands inside, and never leaning toward the water. Even I've caught myself leaning over the bow for a better angle, and Samuel's habit of kneeling or leaning out to get a wider shot shows exactly how tempting those perfect shots can be. That morning, the water was calm, and the reeds provided the perfect backdrop for low-angle shots. Samuel insisted on filming a slow-motion clip of himself, pointing the camera directly into the sunrise while kneeling at the edge of the Mokoro. Temba cautioned him again, reminding him that Nile crocodiles were opportunistic and could strike from as little as 2 meters away, often unseen until it was too late. Samuel laughed it off, saying he knew what he was doing and would stay ready to react. I can relate to that overconfidence, thinking you're ready for anything. Even though he had been briefed repeatedly, Samuel's focus on getting the perfect shot made him underestimate just how quickly a crocodile could react. From my own experiences near rivers, it's easy to assume that staying alert is enough, but in reality, these predators can detect the slightest movement long before you notice them. That brief sense of control can vanish in an instant. The attack happened in seconds. A large male Nile crocodile, estimated at 4 meters and over 450 kilograms, had been lying motionless near a bend in the channel, eyes barely visible. Above the water, Samuel's forward-leaning movement triggered the crocodile's predatory response. With explosive speed, it lunged, seizing him by the lower torso and pulling him partially into the water. The Mokoro rocked violently. Temba shouted, dropped the paddle, and tried to fend the crocodile off with the blunt end. The predator executed a partial death roll, the torque tearing clothing and flesh instantly. Samuel's scream was swallowed by the channel, and the camera toppled into the water, recording only blurry, chaotic footage of the attack. Within moments, Samuel was submerged. Temba reached the nearest riverbank to call for emergency support from the Botswana Predator Conservation Authority. Rescue divers arrived nearly 90 minutes later, but the fast-flowing channels and underwater vegetation had concealed Samuel's body. Post-mortem reports confirmed massive soft tissue loss, multiple fractures, and severe spinal cord trauma as the primary cause of death. The injuries included tearing of muscle and connective tissue from the lower torso, compression fractures along the vertebrae, and extensive damage to internal organs, consistent with the bite force and rotational torque exerted by a Nile crocodile. Medical examiners noted that survival would have been impossible due to rapid blood loss and structural damage sustained in the attack. His remains were found partially upstream, wedged under a submerged tree root system. Post-mortem reports confirmed massive soft tissue loss, multiple fractures, and spinal cord injury as the cause of death. Even I've leaned too far in a canoe for the perfect shot, and Samuel's story is a stark reminder of how quickly a small lapse can turn deadly. Staying seated with hands inside is critical. Minor movements outside recommended positions account for most fatal crocodile attacks. Once the posture is breached, predators act instantly. Samuel's overconfidence turned a controlled experience into a fatal encounter, showing that in predator territory, caution isn't optional, it's survival. The incident prompted local authorities to increase safety advisories for private Mokoro tours, emphasizing low positions in the canoe and strict avoidance of leaning or kneeling near the edge. Samuel's body was repatriated to London, and his family later released a statement urging aspiring wildlife filmmakers to prioritize safety over cinematic ambition. It was October 28, 2018, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves through a suburban neighborhood in Mississauga, Ontario, where the early evening darkness provided cover for the nocturnal animals that had adapted to urban life. It was, in other words, a perfectly ordinary autumn evening in Ontario, right up until Emma Rodriguez decided to play tag with a raccoon. Emma was a 19-year-old college student at the University of Toronto, whose entire social media identity was built around what she called urban wildlife encounters. Her TikTok account featured videos of her hand-feeding squirrels, approaching stray cats in alleyways, and generally treating the urban animal kingdom as a petting zoo that simply hadn't been officially designated as one yet. Her friends described her as someone who had never encountered a creature she wouldn't try to befriend. Emma was walking home from a Halloween party when she spotted a large raccoon rummaging through an overturned garbage can in a residential driveway. The raccoon was focused on its foraging and likely would have remained focused on its foraging had Emma continued walking home. Instead, Emma decided this was an opportunity, approaching the raccoon and engaging it in what she described to her followers as playing tag. Emma began making clicking sounds and moving closer. The raccoon looked up from its foraging with the expression of an animal that had not agreed to any of this. Its body language indicated stress and defensive posturing, which Emma interpreted as curiosity. She continued approaching, now within 8 feet of an increasingly agitated wild animal that was also, though Emma did not yet know this, rabid. Raccoons are highly intelligent and adaptable mammals that typically weigh between 15 and 30 pounds, though exceptionally large males may exceed that range. They have powerful forelimbs, equipped with dexterous paws and sharp claws, designed for climbing and manipulating objects. Urban raccoons are often larger and more aggressive than their rural counterparts due to abundant food sources and reduced fear of humans. The raccoon had backed against a fence corner, trapped by Emma's approach and the barriers around it. Emma reached out her hand to touch the animal. The raccoon, presented with a confined space, a looming human, and an outstretched hand, made the only reasonable decision available to it and lunged. The raccoon's claws raked 4 parallel gashes from Emma's left temple to her jaw, the wounds immediately beginning to bleed heavily. Emma screamed and stumbled backward, but the raccoon pressed its attack, jumping onto her chest and clawing at her arms and torso. The animal's momentum knocked Emma off balance, sending her crashing backward onto the concrete driveway. On the ground, Emma tried to push the raccoon away. It bit her left hand, teeth puncturing through the skin between her thumb and index finger and grinding against the small bones in her hand. Emma's attempts to shake it loose only intensified its grip. The raccoon then released her hand and opened additional lacerations across her forehead and cheek. Emma rolled onto her side, trying to protect her head, but the raccoon continued lunging, scratching her arms and shoulders until Emma's screams finally drew enough attention from nearby residents, who turned on porch lights and shouted to cause the animal to retreat into the shadows. Emergency services arrived within minutes, finding Emma conscious and bleeding heavily from multiple wounds across her face, neck, arms, and hands. She was transported to a trauma center, received over 150 stitches, and was strongly advised to begin post-exposure prophylaxis for rabies. Emma refused the treatment, citing a fear of needles and insisting the raccoon couldn't have been diseased. Despite repeated warnings from medical staff about the fatal nature of untreated rabies, she signed a waiver declining the vaccine series. Animal control set traps in the area. The raccoon was captured 2 days later and tested positive for rabies, confirming that Emma's urban wildlife encounter had been with a diseased animal animal that she had cornered against a fence. Public health officials immediately contacted Emma, urging her to begin treatment. She refused again. 26 days after the attack, Emma developed tingling sensations around her bite wounds, followed by fever and anxiety. By the time she reached the hospital, clinical symptoms of rabies had begun. Once symptoms appear, rabies is nearly 100% fatal. Emma died 6 days later from rabies encephalitis on November 29, 2018. She was 19 years old. Her TikTok account was made private by her family. The videos serving as a tragic reminder that wild animals are not pets and can carry deadly diseases. It was March 7, 2016, in Kruger National Park, South Africa. The afternoon sun hung high and merciless, the temperature approaching 94 degrees. Heat shimmered off the dusty roads where tourists navigated rental vehicles through one of the world's most famous wildlife reserves. The park's self-drive policy allowed visitors the freedom to explore at their own pace, provided they followed one non-negotiable rule: never exit your vehicle except in designated rest areas. Kiara Velez was 24 years old. She worked as an Instagram model from Spain, her carefully curated feed attracting a modest following of travel enthusiasts and aspiring influencers. Her boyfriend had planned the South African safari as a romantic getaway. For Kiara, it was primarily a content opportunity. Friends back in Barcelona described her as someone who would reshoot the same photo 50 times until the lighting was perfect, someone who measured the success of her trips in engagement metrics rather than memories. At 3:40 p.m., they spotted a pride of lions resting approximately 25 meters off the road. The lions were inactive, sprawled in the shade of an acacia tree, their bellies full from an earlier kill. It was the kind of scene that appeared on 1,000 safari brochures: majestic, peaceful, deceptively safe from inside a vehicle. Kiara wanted a clear, unobstructed photo without the window glare that had ruined her previous shots. Her boyfriend warned her not to exit the vehicle, citing the explicit instructions they'd received at the park entrance, the warning signs posted along the road, and the observable fact that there were lions 25 meters away. She dismissed his concerns. She opened the door and stepped out onto the red African soil. The lions initially remained still, watching with the casual interest of predators assessing their environment. One adult lioness stood and began approaching slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. Kiara raised her camera and began framing the shot. The lioness continued closing the distance. At approximately 8 meters, the lioness's posture shifted. Kiara did not lower her camera. Lions are apex predators capable of reaching speeds of approximately 60 kilometers per hour in short bursts. They can cover short distances in just over a second when launching an ambush. Their hunting strategy relies on explosive acceleration from close range, overwhelming prey before it can mount an effective escape. An adult female lion weighs between 260 and 400 pounds, with canine teeth reaching up to 3 inches in length and jaw strength capable of crushing bone. The lioness accelerated. She closed the remaining distance before Kiara could process what was happening. Kiara attempted to retreat toward the vehicle, but she did not have time to react. The lioness knocked her down instantly, the impact driving the air from her lungs as 300 pounds of muscle and momentum slammed into her chest. The lion's jaws clamped down on Kiara's throat. The canine teeth punctured through skin and muscle to compress her trachea and carotid arteries. The bite was precise and efficient, the same killing technique lions use on zebras, wildebeest, and every other prey animal. Blood flow to her brain was interrupted. Her airway collapsed. Her hands clawed uselessly at the lioness's massive head. The attack continued as the lioness maintained her grip, shaking and repositioning to ensure the kill. Within approximately 1 minute, other Pride members began approaching, drawn by the commotion and recognizing a successful kill. A second female moved toward Kiara's leg. A third approached cautiously. The combined presence of multiple predators ensured that any hope of escape was completely eliminated. Her boyfriend remained inside the vehicle, paralyzed by horror and the rational understanding that exiting would only add a second victim to the scene. He honked the horn repeatedly. The lions did not respond to the horn. Rangers arrived approximately 18 minutes later, alerted by radio calls from other tourists who had witnessed the attack from the safety of their vehicles. The lions retreated only when the Rangers' vehicles approached closely. Kiara's body showed severe trauma. Deep puncture wounds to the throat and neck, crushing injuries, and significant blood loss. The injuries were catastrophic and fatal. She had been dead for several minutes before the Rangers arrived. The park issued a statement emphasizing that the attack was entirely preventable and resulted from a clear violation of safety regulations. Additional warning signs were installed along the route, though officials noted that the existing signs had been perfectly adequate for the thousands of visitors who had managed to complete their safaris without incident.
It was November 4th, 2015, and the late spring heat had pushed temperatures past 100 degrees across the dry lowveld of western Eswatini. The roadside vegetation along the national highway south of Manzini had grown thick and tangled, where earlier seasonal rains had produced dense scrub along drainage channels and culvert edges. A 5-man road maintenance crew from the Regional Public Works Department was clearing overgrown vegetation along a 2-mile stretch of highway shoulder. The work was routine, performed seasonally to maintain drainage flow and reduce wildlife encroachment onto the road surface. The crew worked with machetes and hand tools, cutting brush back from the gravel shoulder and clearing debris from concrete drainage culverts. Sifalele Fakudze was a 29-year-old crew member who had worked with the road maintenance program for just over 3 years. He had grown up in a rural homestead outside Manzini and was familiar with the lowveld landscape, though his experience with snakes was limited to common species found near villages. The crew's foreman, Bekitemba Nkambule, 41, had briefed the team at the start of the shift on working in pairs and watching for snakes in the thick brush. The crew had been working for approximately 2 hours without incident. Sifalele was working the leading edge of a dense section adjacent to a culvert, cutting waist-high scrub with a machete in steady rhythmic strokes. A co-worker several yards behind was filming casually on his phone, capturing general progress of the clearing work. Sifalele's machete strokes cut into a dense thicket directly alongside the concrete culvert entrance. The disturbance flushed a black mamba from the vegetation. The snake, estimated by witnesses at roughly 8 feet, emerged rapidly and moved toward the culvert opening. But the cleared debris and the concrete wall created a barrier. The mamba found itself trapped between the advancing worker, the piled brush, and the culvert wall, with no clear escape route. Black mambas are among the most dangerous snakes in Africa, capable of moving rapidly across open ground when threatened. Despite their reputation, mambas will almost always attempt to flee when given an escape route. However, when cornered, the black mamba becomes extraordinarily defensive, slightly flattening the front of its neck while opening its mouth to display the black interior of the mouth that gives the species its name. Strikes from a cornered mamba are delivered in rapid succession, each injecting a potent mix of fast-acting neurotoxins. Symptoms can begin within minutes, though systemic paralysis often develops over the next 1 to 3 hours. Without antivenom, death can occur within several hours. The mamba rose into its defensive posture, roughly a third to nearly half of its body raised off the ground, mouth open wide. Sifalele was less than 5 feet away when the first strike landed on his left forearm. The second hit his upper arm before he could pull away. A third caught his hand as he stumbled backward over the cut brush. The entire sequence lasted no more than 2 or 3 seconds. The mamba then dropped to the ground and disappeared through a gap in the debris pile, vanishing into the culvert. Sifalele collapsed onto the cleared ground, and Nkambule reached him within seconds and directed the crew to get him to the vehicle. The nearest clinic was over 20 miles away. The regional hospital with antivenom was further still, in Manzini. Symptoms appeared within 15 minutes. Tingling spread up his arm and into his face. His vision blurred and swallowing became difficult. By the time the vehicle reached the local clinic, roughly 30 minutes later, his breathing had become shallow and irregular. The clinic lacked both antivenom and ventilation equipment. Staff arranged an emergency transfer to the regional hospital. Sifalele Fakudze went into respiratory paralysis during transport. The combination of multiple bite sites delivering a compounded venom load had overwhelmed his nervous system. His heart stopped before the vehicle reached the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The investigation confirmed that standard safety protocols had been followed and that the encounter resulted from the snake being inadvertently trapped during routine clearing. The co-worker's phone had been damaged when it was dropped during the panic following the attack. The footage was partially recovered, but was too fragmented for public distribution and was filed with the department's incident report.
It was September 3rd, 2016, at a small private bush lodge on the unfenced boundary of a wildlife conservancy in southern Africa. Just after 3 a.m., no moon, air around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The lodge had a rear deck that faced out toward a natural waterhole roughly 90 feet from the back of the building. During the day, that waterhole was a selling point. At night, it was completely invisible, and I think that distinction matters more than it might seem. Peter Vandermeer was 47, an accountant from Rotterdam, traveling with his wife on a 2-week safari package, their first time in sub-Saharan Africa. By most accounts, he was not an adventurous man. He had booked the trip through a travel agent, stuck to the scheduled activities, and had been perfectly content to experience the bush from the back of a vehicle. He had also quit smoking 3 years before the trip. By the second day, he had bought a pack. If the craving had hit him at noon instead of 3 a.m., I genuinely believe he would have made it home. But it didn't, and what he did instead is the reason we're talking about him at all. At dinner that evening, the lodge manager had addressed all guests directly. Lion activity had been recorded near the waterhole on 3 consecutive nights. Guests were not to leave the main building after dark without a staff escort. Not suggested, told. Peter's wife reminded him of this when he got up at 3 a.m. He nodded, picked up his phone, turned on the torch, and put it back down on the nightstand. He found his sandal, wedged it under the rear screen door so it wouldn't latch behind him, and walked out barefoot, into the dark with nothing in his hands. No light, no shoes, no phone, in lion country, at 3 a.m. I don't know what a person has to believe about their own safety to make those choices, but whatever it was, Peter believed it completely. He stopped at the edge of the deck, roughly 55 feet from the water's edge, and lit his cigarette. The waterhole was completely dark. He could not see it from where he stood. He could not see anything beyond the edge of the deck. If I had been standing there, no shoes, no light, no phone, in a place I'd been explicitly warned about less than 6 hours earlier, I'd like to think something would have told me to go back inside. But I also know that's easy to say from here. That detail about the phone is the one I keep returning to. He had a light source in his hand, and he put it down. That single moment shifts this from a story about compounding misjudgments into something much harder to explain. It wasn't that he didn't have the tools to be safer. He had one right there. He just chose not to take it. The conservancy the lodge bordered was not a fenced reserve. There was no barrier between that deck and the open bush beyond it. Animals moved through that land on their own schedules, on routes that had existed long before the lodge was built. The waterhole was a fixed point on one of those routes, which is exactly why the lodge had been positioned to face it. 3 consecutive nights of lion activity at that waterhole was not a coincidence or an anomaly. It was a pattern. And when I look at it that way, Peter wasn't stepping out into an unknown risk. He was stepping into a known one, at the worst possible hour, having actively chosen not to bring the one thing that might have made a difference. The lodge had no exterior lighting on the rear deck side. The path from the door to the deck edge was unlit. I don't raise that to shift responsibility. Peter had been told not to go outside. Full stop. But it does mean that from the moment he stepped through that door, he was operating in conditions where he could not have detected a threat at any meaningful distance. He was effectively blind beyond 10 feet. The waterhole was invisible. Whatever was at it was invisible, and he stood there for 9 minutes. The African lion is most active between midnight and 4 a.m. Adult females, the primary hunters, typically weigh between 270 and 400 pounds and can cover 30 feet in under a second. They do not vocalize before a predatory approach. A lone human in low light, standing still and then suddenly crouching, presents a silhouette and movement pattern consistent with isolated prey. That last part matters because of what Peter did next. After approximately 9 minutes outside, he crouched down near the base of the deck post to stub his cigarette out against the ground. A small movement, the kind nobody thinks twice about. The lioness had already crossed the waterhole and was moving through the low grass on the near side. No sound, no warning. Track evidence recovered. The following morning placed her at approximately 35 feet from Peter at the moment he crouched. She covered that distance in under 2 seconds. When I read that, 35 feet, under 2 seconds, I had to pause. By the time his knee touched the ground, she was already moving. First contact was a bite to the back of the neck and left shoulder, consistent with a predatory approach targeting the cervical region. Peter was driven forward off the edge of the deck onto the dirt path below, a drop of about 18 inches. The impact knocked his sandal free from the screen door. The door swung shut and banged against the frame. His wife heard it. She called out twice. No response. She went to the adjacent staff room and knocked until someone answered. If she had gone to the door herself instead of calling out from inside, if she had stepped out even 30 seconds earlier, I don't know that it would have changed the outcome, but I find myself going there anyway, the way you do with these stories when the margins are that thin. Staff reached the rear deck 6 to 7 minutes later. Peter was found face down in the dirt, 18 feet from the base of the deck. The lioness had withdrawn into the bush. Nothing moving, nothing visible beyond the reach of the flashlights. Just Peter, face down, and the dark pressing in on every side. The nearest medical facility was 38 miles away on an unpaved road. Response reached the lodge approximately 95 minutes after the attack. Cause of death was cervical trauma and blood loss consistent with a large felid attack. The bite to the posterior neck was the determining injury. Track evidence confirmed a single adult female lion approaching from the waterhole direction. Peter's cigarette butt and the displaced sandal were both documented at the scene. The lioness was tracked the following morning by Conservancy rangers. She was identified and monitored, but not destroyed. The attack was assessed as predatory opportunism rather than habituated aggression, and Conservancy policy does not provide for removal on that basis. The lodge conducted an internal review. The case was closed as a death by wildlife encounter. What the review could not resolve was the layering of it, the warning at dinner, the wife's reminder at 3 a.m., the phone left on the nightstand, the sandal wedged under the door. 9 minutes on that deck, barefoot, in complete darkness, 55 feet from a waterhole flagged 3 nights running. If any single one of those held, if he had taken the phone, if the craving had passed, if he had simply turned around, the sequence breaks, but none of them held. And that is the part of this story that doesn't get easier the more you look at it. It was August 14th, 2016, and the sky over Longyear, Bayan, Svalbard sat under the endless Arctic summer light. The tundra, the gravel roads, and the distant glaciers stayed visible in a washed-out, shadowless glow. Cassandra Lee was 22 years old and had traveled to Svalbard during a gap year following her undergraduate degree in media communications. She had been documenting the trip on social media from the moment she landed, building content around every excursion the group took. Her fellow group members later described her as someone who had been documenting the trip heavily on social media. Longyear Bayan is the main settlement in the Svalbard archipelago and operates under strict wildlife safety laws. Every person who travels beyond the marked boundary is required to carry a high-powered rifle or travel with a licensed armed guide. Warning signs at the perimeter are posted in 4 languages. The message is the same in every format. You are now leaving the settlement safety zone. Firearms required beyond this point. Cassandra had arrived 3 days earlier with a guided ecotourism group of 11. The licensed guide, Eric, had delivered the boundary rules on the first morning with specific clarity. He told them that the Svalbard archipelago supports a significant polar bear population within the Greater Barents Sea region, that bears had been found inside the settlement in previous seasons, and that the Arctic in summer has a way of feeling safer than it is because the light never fully disappears. He explained that this feeling was an illusion. He made every member of the group sign an acknowledgement form before the first excursion. For 2 days, Cassandra complied. She filmed from inside the settlement, from guided hikes, from the deck of a boat tour on the fjord. But she also complained openly that the restrictions were overkill. She told another member of the group that the town felt like a controlled bubble built for tourists who are scared of their own shadows. On the 3rd evening, during a group dinner at the guest house, Cassandra had an argument with her closest friend in the group. The dispute centered on the fact that the friend had developed a romantic interest in someone Cassandra had quietly liked since the group first met. The argument ended unresolved. Cassandra pushed back her chair, left the table, and went upstairs without speaking to anyone else. At around 11:30 that night, while the rest of the group was asleep or in the common room, Cassandra put on her jacket, laced her boots, and strapped on her headlamp out of habit. Though the Arctic summer light made it unnecessary, she walked out of the guest house alone without notifying anyone. She brought out her phone to start filming what she will upload to her social media later that day. What Cassandra did not know was that a large male polar bear, weighing approximately 900 to 1,000 pounds, had been reported earlier that week, several miles north of town. While sightings are logged and patrols increased when bears are nearby, the vast terrain surrounding Longyearbyen makes constant visual tracking impossible. Polar bears near Longyearbyen in late summer are often in a significant caloric deficit because the sea ice they rely on for seal hunting has retreated. They are drawn toward settlements by smell and will cover long distances at night without hesitation. Polar bears are one of the only bear species that actively stalk humans as prey, and they can travel silently for long distances despite weighing over 1,000 pounds. Their paw pads are covered in small dermal bumps called papillae that function like built-in traction on ice, allowing them to move with surprising quiet. The bear detected her before she ever saw it. When a polar bear has identified a person as potential prey, it may approach quietly and directly, sometimes without vocalization or visible warning signs. The attack was not a defensive charge. Cassandra, who had stopped filming and was walking slowly in the direction of the lights, was struck from behind without any time to turn or react. The first contact was a strike to her upper back that drove her face first into the ground. She lost the phone on impact. The bear made direct biting contact with the back of her neck and shoulder region. The encounter lasted only a short period before responders arrived. A settlement safety worker driving an ATV spotted movement beyond the boundary and radioed for assistance. He unslung his rifle and drove toward the location. The bear was still present and had to be driven back with a warning shot before emergency responders could reach her. Paramedics and the settlement emergency team arrived on scene within 12 minutes. Cassandra was alive, but in critical condition with severe injuries to her upper body, neck, and left arm. She was transported by ATV to a hospital for emergency stabilization. Given the severity of her injuries, a medical evacuation helicopter was requested from Tromsø on the Norwegian mainland. The helicopter required several hours to reach the Norwegian mainland. She died before it could arrive. The cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries from a polar bear attack resulting in uncontrolled hemorrhage. The polar bear was located and euthanized the following day. Eric was cleared of all responsibility following a full safety review. It was July 27, 2018, at Lake Naivasha in Nakuru County, Kenya, late afternoon. The water looked still. Along the shoreline, thick papyrus reeds and floating vegetation lined the edges. It is a freshwater lake known for a significant hippopotamus population. Ava Bennett, 19, was from Austin, Texas. She ran a travel vlog on social media with around 2,100 followers. Her content was built around filming herself in unfamiliar places and recording her reactions in real time. She had ridden through heavy traffic in Lagos without a helmet while filming. She had eaten unidentified street food in Hanoi and documented what happened next. Neither had ended badly. Each video had added followers. The pattern was the same every time. Go into something unfamiliar, come out the other side, post it. Lake Naivasha was her third stop on a self-funded East Africa trip. And look, I actually spent time going back through her content when I was researching this case. The Lagos video is genuinely compelling. She had a real eye for it, which is part of what makes this so hard to read. She arrived at the lake in the afternoon and found a small independent vendor near the shore who rented out kayaks. The vendor told her the area near the reeds was not safe for paddling and recommended a guide to take her further out into open water. She declined. She pushed off alone. At established lodges on Lake Naivasha, guests are routinely advised to avoid shoreline vegetation, maintain distance from reed beds, and not enter the water without a guide. Those guidelines exist because hippopotamuses spend the day submerged in shallow water along the edges of the lake, often directly beneath the surface with no visible sign of their position. And this is the part that gets me. The guide was offered. It was right there. She said no and paddled out alone. Ava paddled toward the densest section of vegetation along the shoreline. There were signs, subtle movement in the water near the reeds, a disturbance that did not match wind or current. She did not interpret them as anything significant. The surface looked calm. She treated it as confirmation. She had entered the animal's space before she understood that it was occupied. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large animals in Africa. They are highly territorial in water and will respond aggressively to anything that enters their space. They spend the day submerged in shallow water, often near reed beds, and typically surface every few minutes to breathe. meaning a large animal can sit directly below a small boat with nothing visible on the surface. A large adult can weigh over 3,000 pounds, with large canine teeth capable of inflicting severe crushing and puncture injuries, and bite force sufficient to crush bone. In water, an encounter can occur without any visible warning, and often with little to no time to react. I have been obsessed with hippo behavior since I covered a river guide case like this a few weeks ago, and what I can tell you is that the reed line is where you never go. Every guide on that lake knows it. Ava just did not have a guide. A caption had been saved on her phone, but not yet posted. It read, "Nature is so peaceful. If you know, you know." She paddled further into the area. Her phone was mounted on the kayak, recording, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. She was still speaking to her camera when the animal surfaced directly beneath the kayak. The force of it threw the kayak sideways and flipped it. Ava hit the water and came up in the same space as the animal. The hippo drove into her immediately. The first bite closed on her lower torso. The canines drove through soft tissue and into the underlying structure with enough force to fracture the pelvis and damage internal organs on contact. She was pulled under briefly, then released. She surfaced, but could not move. Witnesses on the shoreline saw what happened and raised the alarm. Local responders were contacted and reached the area. She was pulled from the water. She was alive, but her injuries were severe. She was transported to the nearest medical facility. Staff received her in critical condition and initiated emergency intervention, including fluid resuscitation and attempts to stabilize internal injuries. However, the extent of pelvic trauma and internal organ damage, combined with prolonged blood loss and delayed access to advanced surgical care, had already led to irreversible shock. Despite continued efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She was declared dead shortly after arrival. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be hemorrhagic shock due to traumatic injuries sustained in a hippopotamus attack. Local authorities documented the incident and reiterated safety guidance regarding shoreline navigation without a guide. The vendor reported that a warning had been given, though this could not be independently confirmed. Ava's body was repatriated to the United States. Her family held a funeral in Austin. Her social media accounts were later archived, and I will say it plainly, nature is so peaceful, but don't get in the bad side of it. Ava did and paid the price. It was April 8th, 2015, along the banks of the Zambezi River in Lower Zambezi National Park, Zambia, where a wide sandy bank sloped quietly into slow-moving brown water. Just meters from shore, beneath a still inlet partially covered in reeds and algae, something large remained hidden. Hank Barsaga, 52, a semi-retired tobacco farmer from Chinhoyi, Zimbabwe, led a solitary, physically demanding life. Over 6 feet tall and heavily built, he spent most days repairing engines or tending a small garden. Twice divorced and rarely in contact with his adult children, he carried a quiet confidence from years of hands-on work. The canoe safari, arranged by his brother Fanis to reconnect, appealed to Hank, who felt at ease in the river and believed he understood its risks. The early part of the safari went by without incident. The group paddled downstream, camping on riverbanks and islands, observing wildlife from a distance. Their guide, Chisulobanda, 41, repeated the same rules each morning. Stay away from the water's edge, never crouch near the bank, and avoid direct contact with the river. I saw these weren't just casual suggestions, they came from years of fatal incidents, where one wrong step had cost someone their life. Hank acknowledged the instructions, but showed little concern, noting that crocodiles were slow and almost indifferent. The lunch stop appeared safe at first glance. The bank was open, slightly elevated, and offered clear visibility. No tracks or disturbances suggested recent animal activity, yet a narrow inlet branched inward, the water darker and still, partially obscured by reeds and algae. Field studies consistently identify these quiet inlets as high-risk zones. Still water allows crocodiles to remain hidden at extremely close range. After eating, Hank approached the water. His hands were greasy from handling fish, and he ignored the suggestion to use a bottle. He moved to the edge, lowered himself onto one knee, and leaned forward, placing both hands into the river just below the surface. The crocodile had already detected him. Hidden less than 5 meters away, it remained submerged, eyes and nostrils barely above water. The movement of Hank's hands was enough to trigger the predator. I've seen situations like this in my research, and it's striking how quickly a hidden threat can react to the smallest movement. The strike came instantly. The surface erupted. The crocodile lunged forward. Hank reacted too late. His right hand escaped, but his left arm was caught as the jaws closed. The force crushed bone instantly, and pulled him forward. He screamed, struggling, fingers clawing into the wet sand, but the crocodile shifted its grip higher, securing him across the chest and abdomen. His leverage disappeared. Within moments, he was pulled fully into the river. The attack lasted only seconds. The water churned violently as the crocodile spun, maintaining its hold. A single glimpse of Hank's arm appeared above the surface before disappearing. Then, the river returned to calm. It's terrifying to realize how quickly a calm moment can turn deadly. There's almost no time to react once the predator strikes. Faunus reached the bank, but was pulled back. The guides secured the group and called for emergency help, knowing that attempting to enter the water would only risk more lives. By the time a response team arrived over an hour later, the river yielded no sign of him. Hank's remains were recovered the next morning downstream, lodged beneath submerged roots, and confirmed through dental records and a tattoo. The incident was classified as a wildlife-related fatality. The crocodile was not pursued. The area was reassessed, and operators were instructed to avoid riverbanks near inlets or dense vegetation. This outcome highlights the razor-thin margin for safety in such environments. Even small actions, kneeling at the edge, placing hands in the water, ignoring a guide's instruction, can eliminate that margin entirely. From what I've seen, staying back from the water and following the guide's instructions is the only way to feel truly safe. Once a crocodile is underwater, there's almost no way to spot it before it strikes. Hank's body was returned to Zimbabwe. There was no widespread media coverage and no extended investigation beyond standard procedures. What remains is the stark reminder that ordinary, seemingly minor choices can align in seconds to create a fatal outcome, even for someone familiar with the environment. It was April 22nd, 2017, and the oppressive heat of the Australian wet season hung over the remote waterways of the Northern Territory, where the muddy brown water moved slowly between mangrove-lined banks that concealed one of nature's most patient predators. Warning signs in multiple languages dotted the shoreline, their sun-faded text describing recent crocodile attacks and the futility of swimming in these waters. Ben Crawford was a 30-year-old personal trainer from Sydney whose social media presence was built around extreme fitness challenges and death-defying stunts. His YouTube channel had gained a modest following through videos of him performing dangerous workouts in precarious locations, a brand identity that required him to continuously escalate. Friends described him as someone who dismissed safety advice as cowardice, disguised as wisdom, which is a very specific worldview to hold when you are planning to swim in a river full of large reptiles. Ben had driven 12 hours from Darwin specifically to film content at this remote river system, drawn by online reports of large crocodile populations and the area's reputation as one of Australia's most dangerous waterways. He had researched the location obsessively, not for safety information, but for the most dramatic angles and the highest likelihood of crocodile encounters. He got exactly what he came for. Local Aboriginal guides at a nearby fishing camp had warned Ben about the river's reputation when he stopped for directions. They explained that the waterway was home to numerous saltwater crocodiles, including several large males responsible for multiple attacks on livestock and at least 2 human fatalities in recent years. Ben thanked them for the information, while privately dismissing their concerns as exaggerated local folklore designed to keep tourists away from prime fishing spots. The guides, who had lived alongside this river their entire lives, were presumably unaware of how much Ben knew about it after a few hours of online research. The riverbend Ben had selected was particularly notorious among locals. The deep pool was marked by slide marks on the muddy banks and the complete absence of water birds that typically populated similar areas. 2 details that, to anyone paying attention, communicated something important about the local food chain. Ben waded into the shallows, planning to swim across the 50-foot wide channel. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with mature males commonly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators of extraordinary patience, capable of remaining motionless for hours while monitoring potential prey. Their bite force is among the most powerful in the animal kingdom, measuring over 3,700 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush a water buffalo's skull. Ben had waded approximately 15 feet from shore when the water erupted around him. A saltwater crocodile, estimated at 14 to 16 feet in length, launched itself from the muddy bottom with explosive force. The animal's jaws, open to 75 degrees, clamped down on Ben's right leg just above the knee. The initial bite fractured his femur, the crushing pressure collapsing bone and muscle beneath jaws designed to overpower large prey. The crocodile immediately initiated its death roll, spinning through the murky water with Ben trapped in its jaws. The violent rotation disoriented Ben completely, his world becoming a chaos of brown water, pain and the crushing pressure around his leg. Each revolution tore muscle and ligament, the crocodile's teeth grinding against bone and tissue. Ben's attempts to surface for air were futile as the death roll continued, the crocodile's massive weight and momentum keeping him submerged. The spinning motion caused massive internal damage as his body was whipped through the water. Blood dispersed through the current in a way that could have drawn the attention of other crocodiles nearby. After what seemed like an eternity, but lasted perhaps 30 seconds, the crocodile released its grip and repositioned, clamping down on Ben's torso just below his ribcage. The second bite punctured his lung and crushed several ribs, the massive teeth penetrating deep into his chest cavity. Ben's scream was cut short as water filled his punctured lung, his body going into shock from blood loss and trauma. The crocodile began dragging Ben into deeper water. Crocodiles typically drown large prey before consuming it, often dragging carcasses into submerged areas where they may be cached. Ben's consciousness faded as his body was pulled beneath the surface, and the water gradually returned to its deceptively calm state. A search and rescue operation was launched when Ben failed to return to his accommodation that evening. His abandoned vehicle was found at the river access point. Ben's body was never recovered, despite extensive searching of the river system. The Northern Territory government used the incident to reinforce warnings about crocodile-infested waterways, though officials noted that Ben had ignored multiple posted warnings and had deliberately entered water known to be extremely dangerous. Additional signage was installed. It joined the signs that had already been there, which Ben had also ignored. His YouTube channel was deleted by his family shortly after his death. It was April 11, 2014, in Hwange National Park, Zimbabwe. The harsh African sun beat down on the dry landscape, where a guided photography tour had stopped to photograph a herd of elephants near a waterhole. The group consisted of 6 photographers, each equipped with expensive camera gear and varying levels of attention to where they were placing their feet. Lucas Reinhardt was 42 years old. He worked as a wildlife photographer from Munich, his portfolio including published work in several European nature magazines. He had photographed wolves in Romania, bears in Finland, and eagles in Scotland. His trip to Hwange was meant to add African wildlife to his collection. The guide was a Zimbabwean ranger named Tendai. He had positioned the group on foot approximately 100 meters from the elephant herd, maintaining safe distance. The group was standing in tall grass near a fallen log. Tendai had given his standard warning about watching for snakes, particularly puff adders, which were common in the area and had a tendency to lie motionless in the grass or near logs where they were nearly impossible to see. He explained that puff adders were responsible for more snakebite deaths in Africa than any other species, that they did not move away when approached like other snakes, and that their venom caused massive tissue damage and could be fatal without immediate treatment. Lucas was absorbed in his photography, moving slowly through the grass to get different angles of the elephants. He stepped over a fallen log without looking down, his attention focused entirely on his camera's viewfinder. His foot came down directly next to a puff adder that had been lying motionless in the grass on the other side of the log, perfectly camouflaged and completely invisible. Puff adders are ambush predators that rely on camouflage and patience. They do not flee when approached. Instead, they remain motionless and rely on their cryptic coloration to avoid detection. When stepped on or near, they strike defensively with remarkable speed. Their venom is cytotoxic, causing massive tissue destruction, internal bleeding, and potentially fatal complications if untreated. They are thick-bodied snakes that can reach over 4 feet in length, and they possess long fangs capable of delivering a large venom dose deep into tissue. The puff adder struck Lucas's lower leg just above his boot, its fangs sinking deep into his calf muscle. Lucas shouted and jumped back. Tendai immediately identified the snake as a puff adder and radioed for emergency medical evacuation, while instructing Lucas to sit down, remain calm, and keep his leg immobilized. Lucas sat down heavily, his face already pale with shock. The bite site began swelling almost immediately. Within 5 minutes, Lucas's entire lower leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin tight and discolored. He was experiencing severe pain at the bite site, describing it as a burning sensation that radiated up his leg. Tendai kept Lucas's leg immobilized and kept him as still as possible, explaining that movement would spread the venom more quickly through his lymphatic system. A helicopter had been dispatched from the nearest medical facility, but Hwange was remote. The nearest hospital with anti-venom was in Bulawayo, over 200 kilometers away. The helicopter would take at least 90 minutes to arrive. Within 20 minutes, the swelling had spread above his knee, and Lucas was beginning to show signs of systemic envenomation. He was experiencing severe nausea and vomiting. His blood pressure was dropping, and he was becoming increasingly disoriented. The tissue at the bite site had begun to turn dark purple and black, as the cytotoxic venom destroyed muscle and blood vessels. By 40 minutes post-bite, Lucas was in critical condition. The swelling had spread to his hip and lower abdomen. He was experiencing difficulty breathing. His blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. The venom was causing widespread tissue destruction and triggering a systemic inflammatory response. His kidneys were beginning to fail as destroyed muscle tissue released toxins into his bloodstream. The helicopter arrived 95 minutes after the bite. The paramedics immediately started IV fluids and attempted to stabilize Lucas for transport, but his condition was critical. His blood pressure was barely detectable, his breathing was labored, and he was unresponsive. He was loaded into the helicopter and flown toward Bulawayo, but his condition continued to deteriorate during the flight. Lucas went into cardiac arrest approximately 20 minutes into the flight, likely due to a combination of severe shock, electrolyte imbalances from kidney failure, and the systemic effects of the venom. The paramedics performed CPR and administered emergency medications, but they were unable to restore a stable rhythm. Lucas was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the snakebite, before the helicopter reached the hospital. The cause of death was determined to be cardiovascular collapse, secondary to severe puff adder envenomation, complicated by rhabdomyolysis, acute kidney failure, and hypovolemic shock from massive tissue destruction. The medical examiner noted that the remote location and delayed access to antivenom had been contributing factors. Authorities issued a statement emphasizing that the incident, while tragic, was the result of Lucas's failure to watch where he was stepping, despite clear warnings from his guide. Tendai noted in his report that he had specifically warned the group about puff adders in the area and had instructed everyone to watch their footing carefully. The puff adder remained in the area and was not killed or relocated. Park officials noted that this was exactly why guides gave warnings about watching for snakes, and that the warnings were effective for the thousands of tourists who actually followed them.
It was February 8, 2014, and the midsummer heat had baked the red earth of western Queensland into a cracked and dusty expanse. Temperatures had exceeded 105 degrees for 6 consecutive days across the grazing stations west of Longreach, driving wildlife into the shade around homesteads, equipment sheds, and water tanks. Warwick Dunleavy was a 57-year-old station caretaker who had managed the daily operations of a remote cattle property for over 11 years. The property covered nearly 40,000 acres of open rangeland, and the nearest town was more than 90 kilometers of unsealed road to the east. Warwick lived on the property with his wife, Cressida, 54, who handled the station's bookkeeping and communications. Warwick had noticed an eastern brown snake around the main equipment shed over the previous 4 days, spotted 3 separate times near the entrance, likely drawn by the mice nesting in stored feed and machinery. He had discussed calling a licensed snake catcher from town, but the distance and cost made it impractical for what he considered a manageable problem. He had killed brown snakes around the property before using a long-handled shovel, a method common among station workers across rural Queensland, despite being widely discouraged by wildlife authorities. On the morning of the 8th, Warwick spotted the snake coiled near the base of a corrugated iron wall panel on the shed's shaded side. He retrieved a flat-bladed shovel and a plastic storage bin, positioning the bin nearby in case he could pin and contain the snake. Cressida had followed him out and was standing near the shed entrance with her phone, filming casually. The brown snake was an adult, approximately 5 feet in length, its coloring blending almost perfectly with the dry earth along the shed wall. It remained motionless as Warwick approached. He moved the shovel blade toward the snake's midsection, attempting to pin it against the ground. The moment the blade touched the snake's body, the brown exploded into motion. Eastern brown snakes are responsible for more snakebite deaths in Australia than any other species. Adults typically reach 4 to 6 feet in length and possess a highly toxic venom that disrupts the blood's clotting system, initially triggering abnormal clotting that rapidly consumes clotting factors, leaving the blood unable to clot normally. This venom-induced coagulopathy can lead to cardiovascular collapse or cardiac arrest. Eastern browns are exceptionally fast, capable of striking and recoiling faster than most people can react to. A critical danger of brown snake envenomation is the deceptively mild initial presentation. Bite wounds are often small and painless, leading victims to believe they have not been seriously envenomated. By the time systemic symptoms appear, often 30 minutes to an hour later, the venom has already disrupted clotting mechanisms to a degree that may be irreversible without immediate hospital treatment. The snake struck as it fled, connecting connecting with Warwick's lower leg just above his work boot. The bite lasted a fraction of a second before the snake broke away, racing along the shed wall and disappearing beneath a stack of corrugated iron sheets. Warwick found 2 small puncture marks above his sock line. There was minimal pain and almost no bleeding. Warwick walked back to Cressida and showed her the bite. He sat down on a bench near the shed entrance and wrapped a compression bandage loosely around his lower leg. The standard pressure immobilization technique calls for a firm bandage covering the entire limb. Warwick's bandage was too loose and covered only the bite area. Approximately 40 minutes after the bite, Warwick became visibly pale and reported an intensifying headache. He stood to walk inside, but became unsteady. The bite site itself showed little visible change, but his condition was deteriorating systemically. Cressida called the regional emergency line immediately. An ambulance was dispatched, but the 90-kilometer unsealed road meant an arrival time well over an hour away. A helicopter retrieval was requested, but was operating on another emergency further north. Over the next 20 minutes, he began bleeding from his gums. His breathing became irregular, and he lost consciousness on the floor of the homestead approximately 1 hour after the bite. The ambulance arrived approximately 90 minutes after the call. Paramedics found Warwick in cardiac arrest. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Warwick Dunleavy was pronounced dead at the property. The cause of death was determined to be venom-induced coagulopathy and cardiovascular collapse. Cressida's phone footage was provided to the coroner's office during the inquest and was retained as part of the sealed case file. The family did not consent to its public distribution.
It was July 9th, 2017, and the mid-morning temperature in a park in Wyoming, Idaho, had already reached 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley stretched wide and golden under the summer sky, the grass moving in a low wind and the distant ridgelines shimmering in the heat. A bison herd grazed near the creek. Further out in the meadow, partially obscured by tall grass, a grizzly bear was feeding steadily. Several cars had already pulled into the roadside viewing area. Margaret Elaine Doss was 58 years old and had retired the previous year from a career in human resources management in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had come to the park with her husband as part of a 2-week road trip through the national parks. He would later describe her as someone with a deep, genuine affection for animals who believed that animals could sense a person's calm intentions. She had volunteered at an animal shelter in Scottsdale for years and had told her husband before the trip that she wanted to come home with better wildlife photographs than the ones from her previous visit to that same park 15 years earlier. The Lamar Valley is one of the most productive wildlife watching locations in North America. The National Park Service requires all visitors to maintain at least 100 yards from bears and wolves and 25 yards from all other large wildlife. These are federal legal requirements. Rangers patrol the valley throughout the day. A ranger vehicle was parked at the far end of the pullout when Margaret and her husband arrived. Margaret had a digital camera with a moderate zoom lens and felt the distance was producing images that were too small. She told her husband the bear looked completely calm and that she only wanted to move closer for a better angle. He told her clearly not to. She waited several minutes while the ranger at the far end of the pullout was speaking with another visitor and scanning the meadow through binoculars. The ranger had noticed intermittent movement in the grass that suggested the possibility of a cub, but had not yet confirmed it before Margaret stepped off the road. Margaret stepped off the road shoulder and into the meadow grass, moving slowly and deliberately, the way she moved around nervous dogs at the shelter. She moved more than 100 yards from the road, well inside the required safety distance. The sow's posture changed first. Her head came up sharply, her ears angled back. She gave a short, forceful woof and rocked forward a step. What Margaret did not fully grasp in that moment was that she was now within close range of a mother bear that likely had a cub bedded in the grass between them. At that distance, especially if a cub was nearby, a direct human approach is commonly interpreted as a defensive threat. Mother grizzlies account for a significant portion of serious bear attacks in North America because they respond instantly to perceived threats near cubs. The bear surged forward. The charge showed no prolonged hesitation, typical of some bluff displays. It was fast and direct. She covered the distance in a few seconds. Margaret turned when she heard the sudden rush through the grass and saw the movement in her peripheral vision. She attempted to run, but managed only a step or two before the bear reached her. At the far end of the pullout, the ranger shouted and ran toward the road edge, bringing up the launcher he had already been holding after noticing possible cub movement in the grass. The charge detonated between the sow and the road edge, but she was already within striking distance. As the sow veered, her right forepaw struck Margaret across the upper back and shoulder in a powerful swiping motion. The impact knocked Margaret forward into the grass. She fell hard and remained face down, stunned. The bear hovered for a brief second over her, huffing sharply, then pivoted away, returning quickly to the area where the cub was concealed. She positioned herself between the cub and the road and did not re-engage. The ranger reached Margaret within moments and called for the medical unit. The wound extended from Margaret's left shoulder blade toward her lower back in a deep, ragged tear that disrupted multiple layers of muscle and included puncture wounds consistent with a brief bite, introducing significant contamination into the underlying tissue. She was conscious but disoriented and showing signs of shock. A park medical unit arrived within minutes. She was stabilized on scene, transported by ground ambulance to Mammoth Hot Springs for transfer, and then airlifted to a medical center in Idaho Falls. She underwent surgery that afternoon for wound cleaning, tissue repair, and aggressive debridement. She initially responded well to treatment. Over the next 2 days, however, extensive devitalized tissue and contamination from the wound led to complications requiring additional surgical debridement. Despite intravenous antibiotics and additional surgical intervention, she developed a severe systemic infection. Her condition deteriorated, and she died on July 13th from septic shock related to the traumatic injuries. The authorities referenced the incident in updated visitor safety messaging at the park entry stations the following season. It was March 3rd, 2018, in the Northern Territory, Australia. The estuary outside Darwin was low and quiet at dusk, the tidal water dark and still, the last of the light sitting flat across the surface. It was the kind of place that looked calm because nothing was moving. That is not the same thing as safe. Liam Carter, 22, ran a wildlife content page on social media with around 3,400 followers. He had built it around a single recurring format he called Too Close. The premise was straightforward: find a dangerous animal, get as close as possible, film the reaction. He had approached a brown snake at close range. He had waded through floodwater in Kakadu National Park during wet season. Neither had ended badly. The format was working. His follower count had grown steadily with each upload, and the comments on his most recent videos were pushing him towards something bigger. Several followers had been asking when he was going to film a crocodile. One comment that appeared multiple times across his last 3 posts read, "Do a croc next." And look, this pattern comes up every single time in content creators' cases. The audience does not know they are part of the story. They are just asking for the next video. He had driven up to the Northern Territory with a friend. The two had made the trip together, with the plan of filming new content over several days. His friend was there for most of it, helping carry equipment, watching from the bank, waiting while Liam got closer to things than most people would consider. He had been in the Northern Territory for 4 days when he identified the animal in the estuary. He posted about it that afternoon. The response was immediate. People wanted to see it. That unbroken record of walking away, combined with the pressure of an audience expecting the next escalation, was the most dangerous thing about him by the time he arrived at the water's edge. What gets me about that is how invisible that pressure is from the outside. His friend was standing on the bank watching. The audience was watching, and every single one of them had watched him walk away before. He had identified a large saltwater crocodile in the area through local reports and social media posts from other users in the region. The animal was estimated at around 13 feet. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest reptiles on Earth and among the most effective ambush predators alive. They do not chase or display before attacking. They wait. They can remain motionless for hours, fully submerged or barely visible at the waterline, and move when the calculation is right. They detect movement through pressure sensors along the jaw and through sensitivity to surface vibration, which means there is no safe angle of approach and no blind spot that reduces the risk of detection. The authorities had installed warning signs at multiple points along the estuary following prior fatalities in the area. Liam walked past them. He had watched online content suggesting that approaching a crocodile from a certain angle reduced the risk of detection. The same source had noted clearly, that no angle made close proximity safe. Liam had taken the first part and left the second behind. He strapped his GoPro to his chest, set it recording, and waded into the water at dusk. His friend stayed on the bank. The water came to his knees. He moved slowly, keeping his profile low, angling toward the area where he believed the animal was resting. He kept moving forward. And this is the moment I find hardest to sit with. Because at knee depth, in that light, with that animal already in the water, the outcome was already decided. Liam just did not know it yet. The crocodile did not move for approximately 11 seconds after Liam entered its range. Stillness is not disengagement. It is the final phase before a strike. The animal was already tracking him before the lunge began. The crocodile came forward from the waterline in a single explosive movement, covering the distance between them. Before Liam had processed what was happening, the jaws closed on his lower body with a force that made resistance impossible. The bite of a large saltwater crocodile can exceed 3,000 pounds of force per square inch. Bone and tissue gave way instantly. Liam was pulled off his feet and dragged below the surface in the same motion. What followed was the death roll. The crocodile rotated its body violently, spinning through the water with Liam locked in its jaws. The GoPro captured 11 seconds of footage before the water covered the lens. On the bank, his friend was screaming into his phone. I have thought about that friend a lot since I first read this case. He drove up there with Liam. He had been on every shoot. He watched it happen from the bank, and there was nothing he could do. That is something a person carries for the rest of their life. Emergency services were notified immediately by his friend on the bank. Authorities secured the area, but entry into the water was delayed until the crocodile could be located and conditions assessed as safe. Initial recovery efforts that evening were unsuccessful due to visibility and tidal movement. Search operations continued over the following days across the estuary system. Liam Carter's remains were recovered in multiple locations consistent with tidal dispersal. A formal medical examination was conducted following recovery. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be fatal injuries and drowning resulting from a saltwater crocodile attack. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed the behavior as a standard ambush predation response. Warning signage in the area was documented. The location was temporarily restricted during recovery operations. His final footage was retained by investigators and not released. His channel was later removed to prevent others from doing something like that. It was September 14, 2014, and the humid air of Kerala's Western Ghats hung heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and decomposing vegetation, where the dense forest canopy filtered the afternoon light into dappled patterns on the jungle floor. The remote trekking trail wound through prime habitat for some of India's most dangerous reptiles, including the species responsible for thousands of deaths annually across the subcontinent. Ryan Venko was a 22-year-old backpacker from Vancouver, Canada, whose gap-year journey through Southeast Asia had been documented extensively on his travel blog. His posts consistently emphasized his willingness to take risks that other travelers avoided, and he had built a modest online following by photographing himself in increasingly dangerous situations. Friends who had traveled with Ryan described him as someone who treated local warnings as challenges rather than legitimate safety concerns. Ryan had hired a local guide for the 3-day trek through the Periyar Wildlife Sanctuary, an experienced tracker named Ravi who knew the forest, its wildlife, and exactly how dangerous both could be. Ryan had made it clear from the outset that he wasn't interested in what he called tourist-friendly experiences. Ravi had warned him specifically about the high concentration of venomous snakes that became active during the monsoon season. Ryan had nodded, and then, on the second day, wandered off alone anyway. He was following a game trail that led to a small clearing when he spotted a large snake coiled beneath a fallen log approximately 10 feet away. The snake's distinctive hood and striking black and yellow banding immediately identified it as a king cobra, one of the world's most dangerous venomous species. Ryan identified it as a content opportunity, rather than backing away slowly, as Ravi would have advised had Ryan not left Ravi behind. Ryan approached the snake with his camera, planning to capture close-up shots of what he appears to have assumed was a docile, sun-basking reptile. King cobras are the world's longest venomous snakes, capable of reaching lengths exceeding 18 feet and weighing up to 20 pounds. They can deliver large volumes of neurotoxic venom capable of killing a human without treatment, with severe cases leading to respiratory failure within 1 to several hours without ventilatory support. Ryan had approached to within 6 feet of the coiled snake when when it began displaying defensive behavior. The cobra raised its head and spread its distinctive hood, a warning signal recognizable to anyone with even passing familiarity with cobras, which Ryan did not appear to have. The snake's forked tongue flicked rapidly as it assessed the threat. Instead of retreating, Ryan continued moving closer, holding his camera at arm's length to capture what he believed would be an award-winning wildlife photograph. When he extended his free hand toward the snake, apparently intending to touch its hood, the cobra struck. The snake's fangs penetrated Ryan's right hand just below his knuckles, injecting a large volume of neurotoxic venom into the tissue of his hand. The bite lasted a fraction of a second. Ryan jerked his hand back, staring at the two small puncture wounds already beginning to swell and discolor. The cobra struck a second time as he stumbled backward, catching his forearm before withdrawing beneath the log. The snake had done what it needed to do and returned to its log. Ryan turned and ran blindly through the forest. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms of envenomation. His vision blurred, his speech slurred. Muscle weakness spread through his limbs as the neurotoxin began its work, making it increasingly difficult to stay upright as he crashed through undergrowth, searching for the guide he had deliberately left behind. Ryan collapsed approximately 200 yards from the bite site as his respiratory system began to shut down. He managed to activate the emergency beacon on his GPS device before losing consciousness. Piece of technology he had apparently packed alongside his camera, but not his judgment. Ravi found Ryan's body 3 hours later, guided by the GPS signal. A helicopter evacuation was attempted, but Ryan was pronounced dead before reaching medical facilities. The cause of death was respiratory failure, secondary to king cobra envenomation. The remote location made survival impossible, even with immediate intervention, which Ryan had ensured would not be available by separating from his guide in a forest he did not know, to photograph a snake he did not understand, for a blog that had a modest following. It was November 19, 2016, in South Luangwa National Park, Zambia. The African afternoon sun beat down on the banks of the Luangwa River, where hippos spent their days submerged in the water to keep cool. The bush camp where Thomas Greer was staying offered walking safaris, guided tours on foot that allowed tourists to experience the African bush at ground level. Thomas Greer was 58 years old. He worked as an accountant from Manchester. The South Luangwa Safari was a bucket list trip booked after his divorce. The walking safari had been proceeding normally until the group encountered a large bull hippo approximately 80 meters from the riverbank, grazing on grass in the late afternoon. The guide was a Zambian man named Moses, who carried a rifle specifically for situations like this. He immediately stopped the group and began quietly moving them in a wide arc to avoid the animal. He explained in a whisper that hippos were responsible for more human deaths in Africa than any other large animal, that they were extremely territorial and aggressive, and that they could run at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, despite weighing over 3,000 pounds. He explained that the hippo was between the group and the river, which meant the animal would perceive any movement toward the water as a threat to his escape route. Thomas, who had been at the back of the group, decided that Moses was being overcautious and that he could get a better photo if he moved closer. He separated from the group and began walking directly toward the hippo, his camera raised. Moses noticed immediately and began urgently whispering for Thomas to stop and return to the group. Thomas waved him off and continued walking. Hippos have poor eyesight but excellent hearing. The hippo's head lifted from grazing, his small ears rotating toward the sound of Thomas's footsteps. At approximately 40 meters, the hippo turned to face Thomas directly. His mouth opened in a massive yawn. Not a sign of tiredness, but a threat display, revealing canine teeth that can reach 20 inches in length and bite force that can crush a crocodile's skull. Thomas continued walking forward. At approximately 25 meters, the hippo's body language shifted. His head lowered, his ears pinned back, and he began moving toward Thomas. Moses began shouting now, ordering Thomas to move sideways away from the hippo and away from the river. Thomas finally stopped walking forward, but he did not move sideways. He stood still. The hippo did not lose interest. At approximately 15 meters, the hippo charged. Despite weighing over 3,000 pounds, hippos can accelerate to 30 miles per hour in short bursts. The charge was explosive, a wall of muscle closing the distance in seconds. Thomas turned to run. He did not have time. The hippo caught Thomas within seconds, his massive jaws opening and clamping down on Thomas's torso. Hippo jaws can open to nearly 180 degrees, and the bite force is sufficient to crush bone. The canine teeth punctured through Thomas's lower back and abdomen, the force of the bite crushing his pelvis and causing massive internal damage. The hippo bit down again, this time on his upper body. The massive teeth punctured through his chest and shoulder, crushing ribs and causing massive trauma to his lungs and chest cavity. The hippo then began trampling Thomas with his enormous feet, each impact breaking bones. The animal pressed his massive weight down on Thomas's body, crushing his chest and abdomen. Moses fired 2 warning shots into the air. The hippo paused, looked toward the sound, then returned his attention to Thomas's body, biting down once more on his legs. Moses fired another shot, this time closer. The animal finally disengaged and began moving toward the river. Moses and the group rushed to Thomas's position, but it was immediately clear that he was beyond help. His body had been catastrophically damaged, massive bite wounds to his torso, chest, and legs, crush injuries from trampling, and massive internal bleeding. Rangers arrived approximately 90 minutes later, alerted by radio. Thomas's body was recovered and transported back to camp. The cause of death was determined to be massive trauma from multiple hippo bites, resulting in crushed organs, broken bones throughout his body, and catastrophic blood loss. South Luangwa authorities issued a statement emphasizing that the attack was entirely preventable and resulted from Thomas's decision to separate from his group and approach a hippo against his guide's explicit warnings. The hippo was not tracked or euthanized, as the attack was classified as a defensive response to a perceived threat to the animal's escape route. Moses requested a week off before returning to work. He had fired his rifle in defense of tourists before, but he had never watched someone ignore every warning and walk directly into a hippo attack.